The fear did not begin with the first Panther found gutted on a muddy French roadside, nor with the jagged holes discovered in Panzers destroyed outside St. Lo. It began earlier, quietly, uncertainly, and with more rumor than proof during the uneasy weeks after the Allied breakout from Normandy. In those days, German tank crews lived in a strange half-world where confidence had begun to erode, but collapse had not yet arrived, where a man could still believe in his armor 1 hour and doubt it the next. And into that fragile middle ground slipped a new whisper. The Americans had brought a heavier gun to France. No one knew its name, and no one cared. The important thing was that it could reach farther, hit harder, and punch holes where no American gun had punched holes before. Corporal Otto Hagen first heard the rumor in late July, while helping refill ammunition racks near a hedgerow track south of Caen. A supply corporal, fresh from a headquarters briefing, muttered that American anti-aircraft batteries were being repurposed to kill tanks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "High blast! High velocity!" the man said, as if reciting a warning issued higher up the chain. "Something like our flak act, but American." He shrugged, uncertain. Maybe bigger." The idea felt absurd. The Americans, for all their industry, had never produced a true rival to the great German 88. Their 75mm guns were respectable. Their 76mm guns were troublesome at best, but a heavy, long-barreled gun with the penetration of an 88. It sounded like one more tale invented in a foxhole. Then the corporal showed Hagen a photograph. It had been folded many times and carried damp fingerprints across its edges. The image showed a long, thick-barreled gun mounted on what looked like an American M10 tank destroyer. The breech block was enormous. The barrel shroud ran almost the full length of the chassis. Someone had scrawled in faint pencil along the bottom margin, "90 millimeter." Hagen stared longer than he meant to. The proportions were all wrong for a light weapon. A gun that size was meant for altitude or armor, nothing in between. He tucked the photo into his tunic and said nothing. 2 days later, retreating across fields churned by weeks of artillery, his Panther rolled past the charred wreck of a German self-propelled gun whose armor had been pierced in a way Hagen had never seen before. The hole was narrow, brutal, and clean-edged, as if a blacksmith's punch had been driven straight through the plate. The exit side was far worse, a cratered burst of metal blown outward in a ragged yellow bloom. A veteran mechanic, studying the wreck, muttered, "That was no 76. His tone left little room for doubt. American gun crews worked quickly. That much the Germans already knew. What unsettled them now was the possibility that the Americans had begun to work powerfully. A heavier gun meant a heavier threat, and if the Americans had plenty of anything, it was equipment. Through August, rumors multiplied like vines. German radio intercept units began hearing Allied references to dual-purpose 90. Analysts in rear areas pored over captured fragments, trying to match them to known calibers, and found themselves drawing uncomfortable conclusions. Tank crews along the front, sleep-deprived and short of fuel, shared every scrap of hearsay they encountered. Some accounts were clearly exaggerated. Others carried enough truth to feel dangerous. One persistent story claimed that the Americans were mounting the gun, whatever it was, on their Sherman tanks. This particular rumor terrified new recruits and amused the veterans, who dismissed it as impossible. The Sherman hull could not support such size. But even the veterans fell silent when a different rumor spread, that the gun was being dug in along approaches, used like a field piece, given full fields of fire across open ground. A stationary gun, especially a heavy one, was something to fear. By the time German armor began pulling back toward the Seine, Hagen had heard half a dozen variants and believed none of them completely. What he believed was simpler, that a new American weapon existed, that it was heavy, and that it was appearing more often than it should. In early September, after days of withdrawal through rain and shattered villages, Hagen's company reached a small farming settlement whose church had lost its steeple weeks earlier. The stone air inside the nave smelled of wet dust and burned sage. Their commander, Feldwebel Karl Kruger, received new orders at dusk. They were to hold positions behind the village for as long as possible. American armored patrols had been sighted beyond the next rise. Field artillery was expected to range in by morning. That night, Kruger called his senior crewman into the shell of the church. He held a translated Allied field report captured somewhere near Argentan and rushed through intelligence channels until it reached them. The report described a new American towed gun firing heavy shot at ranges in excess of 1,500 yards, with muzzle energy approaching that of German 88mm pieces. The men exchanged glances. One said quietly, "Then the Americans have built their own Flak 88. Kruger shook his head. "Maybe not the same, but heavy enough." He tapped the paper, his jaw tightening. "They have it in numbers." That was the part no one wanted to hear. Late that night, rain pattered through the broken roof tiles of the church as Hagen tried to sleep beside the Panther's right track. The turret loomed above him like a guardian. He pressed his shoulder against the cool metal, seeking reassurance, but the memory of the punched-through self-propelled gun returned again and again. How thick had its armor been? How far had the shot traveled? What angle? What velocity? The numbers would not line up neatly in his mind, because fear never followed arithmetic. Before dawn, American artillery began probing the village. The first shells were familiar. Sharp whistling, sudden earth spouts, the flat thump of high explosive against stone. But then, moments apart, came two deeper concussions that felt like hammer blows against the chest. The Panther's hull vibrated with each impact, not from a near hit, but from sheer pressure in the air. Hagen lifted his head. That was different. Kruger, crouched beside the radio antenna, said nothing. He waited, listening. Another blast followed, heavier than the rest. A horse somewhere in the village screamed and bolted. Birds erupted from the rafters of the ruined church, fluttering wildly in the half-light. Only the largest guns made birds fly like that. When the barrage ended, smoke drifted over the village in low, greasy strands. Kruger and Hagen walked toward the outskirts, stepping around fallen beams and shattered masonry. A few houses still smoldered. At the far end of the main road lay the twisted remnants of a Stu-G that had been caught during the bombardment. The front armor plate bore a small, perfectly circular hole, too perfect to be accidental, too devastating to ignore. The interior was scorched black. A supply sergeant standing beside the wreck puffed slowly on a cigarette that shook in his fingers. "New gun," he muttered. "A heavy one. 90, they say. Maybe more." He flicked ash into the wind, then added, "Nothing we have stops it." For a long moment, no one replied. When they returned to their positions, the company mechanic traced the hole with a gloved finger and swore softly. "Clean entry," he said. "High velocity, higher than their old guns. This is not shrapnel. This is a spear." News of the destroyed Stu-G traveled quickly. Within an hour, an anxious message arrived from regimental headquarters instructing all armored crews to assume the Americans possessed a long-range, high-penetration weapon capable of defeating frontal armor on certain vehicles. Tank commanders were told to avoid exposed ridge lines and to prioritize first-shot accuracy in any engagement. "Do not rely on armor protection," the directive warned. "Engage at once. Relocate at once." These were not routine orders. These were orders issued when doctrine itself had begun to fail. By midday, American infantry appeared at the far hedgerow, advancing cautiously. Behind them, just visible when the wind cleared the smoke, glinted the long barrel of a towed gun. Kruger steadied his binoculars. "There," he murmured. Hagen followed his gaze. He saw only a sliver of metal, a section of shield plate, and the faint silhouette of a crew setting their weapon, but the proportions were unmistakable. The barrel extended too far beyond the shield, carried too much thickness at the breech, and sat on a carriage too substantial for any field gun of ordinary caliber. "It is the same gun," Hagen said, though no one had asked. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." That afternoon, the Americans brought it forward another 20 yards. Then they stopped. They did not need to do more. The gun commanded the main road, the pasture beyond it, and the shallow depression leading toward the village square. Its crew moved deliberately, like men confident in what their weapon could achieve. Kruger ordered all turrets kept low and engines ready at the first sign of movement. But no duel followed that day. The Americans were content to wait. At dusk, Hagen sat inside the Panther's turret as the last light drained from the sky. He listened to the slow ticking of cooling metal and to the distant clanking of American tanks repositioning for the night. He ran his hand along the inner wall of the turret, tracing the steel as one might trace the shape of a thought. The armor had once felt invincible. Now it felt merely thick. "Do you believe it?" their gunner asked quietly. "That this new gun kills at ranges we cannot see?" Hagen hesitated. Then he answered with the truth neither of them wished to acknowledge. "I think it already has. And somewhere beyond the dark hedgerows, under tarpaulins and camouflage nets, the American 90mm gun settled into its latest position, silent, patient, and unknown to the men who feared it, only beginning its work. The fear grew not from any single clash, but from the slow, creeping realization that the 90mm had begun to shape the battlefield, even when unseen. Long before German tank crews ever looked down its muzzle, they moved differently because of it. They studied ground differently, scanned hedgerows differently, lingered less in open fields, and trusted their armor a little less each week. It was a strange thing to fear a weapon not yet encountered, but the unknown is almost always the sharper blade. By late September, Hagen's battalion had fallen back behind a stretch of high ground, scarred by days of bombardment. The soil was pitted with shell holes, many filled with rainwater that shimmered under the morning light like fragments of shattered glass. The air had grown cold enough that men kept their collars turned up, even inside their tanks, and breath fogged in the cramped spaces between turret walls. As they maneuvered into a new firing line, Kruger gathered the crew around a map spread across the Panther's engine deck. "You will hear more of their new gun," the Feldwebel said, his hand resting heavily on the paper. "Intelligence believes it is not isolated. They are bringing them forward with their armored divisions, perhaps dozens." He paused, glancing at the faces around him. "Do not fool yourselves. If they place these guns on a ridge or road and support them with infantry, they will dominate the ground." The men nodded, though none spoke. It was not the first time they had heard such warnings, but something in Kruger's tone made it feel different. He was not a man prone to exaggeration. If anything, he had the habit of downplaying danger to steady younger soldiers. Hearing unease in his voice unsettled them more than any report. That afternoon, a column of refugees passed along the road south of the village, pushing carts piled with quilts, tarnished pots, and whatever valuables could be scavenged during their flight. A thin-boned woman, carrying a child, paused beside Hagen's tank. "Artillery compte?" she asked. Hagen only dipped his head. She walked on, shoulders bent beneath the weight of fear. It struck him then that civilians had begun to sense it too. The arrival of heavy American guns, altering even the movement of those with no understanding of calibers or muzzle velocities. Something about the distant concussion told them to hurry. 3 days later, while rain swept across the fields and low clouds hid the smoke drifting from broken chimneys, Hagen's crew received orders to take up a hull-down position overlooking a shallow valley. The position had been chosen carefully. A slight elevation, a stone wall half collapsed, and a line of trees thin enough to hide the Panther, yet not impede its field of fire. But even from their covered stance, the men felt exposed. Every hollow in the valley seemed to hold a threat they could not quite see, every ridge a place where the rumored American guns might sit unseen behind camouflage nets and brush. They waited for nearly an hour before the first shells fell. The opening salvo landed 200 meters short, sending fountains of mud and broken grass skyward. The second landed closer, shaking dust from the Panther's turret seams. The third boomed with a deeper timbre, lower, heavier, almost like the crack of distant thunder. Kruger stiffened. "There," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "That is their 90. A moment later, the valley echoed with another blast, this one followed by the unmistakable whistle of a shell passing overhead. It crashed into the far slope, exploding in a violent arc of earth and shattered stone. The recoil of the blast rattled through the Panther's treads. Even inside the steel shell of their tank, the men felt the concussion in their teeth. The artillery duel continued for minutes, though it felt like hours. German guns replied from concealed positions deeper in the woods, their reports sharper, more abrupt. The Americans answered with a rolling pattern that suggested careful adjustment. Move fire a little left, walk it forward, lift it, test the target. Hagen knew enough about artillery to recognize discipline when he heard it. These were not green crews. They were patient, methodical, and unhurried, men who knew the effect they could achieve. When the exchange finally died down, Kruger ordered Hagen and the driver, Müller, to remain alert. "If their gun crews push forward," he warned, "they will drag those 90 millimeters behind tank destroyers or half-tracks. If they set one up on that ridge, we withdraw at once." It was a strange order. Withdraw immediately, without engagement. The Panther had been built for frontal duels, its long-barreled 75 more than capable of knocking out Shermans at ranges far beyond the Americans' usual reach. But this new threat turned the equation around. Armor that had once felt invincible now seemed a liability. And the unsettling thing was this: no one in the crew had yet seen the 90. Its power was known only by effect. That night, rain pattered steadily against the tank hull, leaving streaks across its camouflage paint. The men slept poorly. Each distant rumble of thunder made them stiffen, unsure whether it was weather or artillery. At one point, Hagen climbed from the turret and stood under the shelter of a tree, staring out toward the dark ridge line where the American positions lay unseen. He imagined the guns sitting silent in the night, their long barrels angled slightly upward, their crews resting in dugouts nearby. He wondered if those men felt fear too, or whether they trusted their weaponry in the same way German tank crews had once trusted theirs. The next morning, the battalion received grim news. An entire company of Panzer IFOs had been destroyed to the south during an ambush. The details were confused, but one thing was certain. Several of the tanks had been penetrated clean through the glacis plate, and impact signatures suggested a shell heavier than the 75 or 85 used by American tanks. 90, someone whispered. As the reports spread through the battalion, the atmosphere shifted. Men grew quieter. Conversations broke off midway. Even veterans with years of experience began checking their gear twice, adjusting the straps of their helmets, packing and repacking ammunition cases. No one said the word fear aloud, but everyone felt it tightening across their shoulders like a second uniform. 2 days later, the battalion commander called all officers and senior NCOs to a briefing inside a barn whose roof had partially collapsed. The floor smelled of old hay and damp wood. A lantern flickered from a hook on a beam, casting long shadows across the gathered men. On a table lay photographs captured from American prisoners, towed guns with thick barrels, tank destroyers mounting long tubes that reached far over their hulls, ammunition crates marked with unfamiliar American ordnance codes. "Our intelligence confirms the Americans are fielding the M1 gun in increasing numbers," the commander said, tapping one of the photos. 90 millimeter, high velocity, capable of penetrating our armor at ranges exceeding the 800 meters we once considered safe. His voice remained steady, but his eyes gave him away. "You will avoid Unnecessary duels. You will not expose your vehicles on ridges. You will relocate positions after every volley. And you will remember, this gun is now the backbone of their anti-tank defense. A silence followed, broken only when Kruger asked, "Sir, how widespread? Do we face a few batteries or entire battalions?" The commander exhaled slowly. "Entire battalions." No one spoke again. Over the next week, Hagen's battalion fell back toward the Siegfried Line, now a battered ribbon of dragon's teeth and bunkers, some damaged, others hastily patched. The roads leading east were cluttered with vehicles, ambulance trucks, horse-drawn wagons, fuel carriers, motorcycles with sidecars. Many had been abandoned where they ran out of petrol. The sight of so much wreckage only deepened the men's unease. Every few kilometers, they passed the remains of armored vehicles hit during earlier clashes, a Panzer P4 with its turret blown off, a half-track warped by fire, a Tiger whose frontal armor had been punched through so cleanly that daylight shone through the exit wound in the rear plate. That tank in particular unsettled Hagen. The Tiger's armor was legendary, its reputation carried across continents. To see it, breached so effortlessly, felt like witnessing the fall of a fortress thought unassailable. "They hit that with a 90, Kruger muttered. "Nothing else could have done that from range." As they pressed deeper into Germany, word spread that the Americans had paired their new guns with improved fire control procedures. Forward observers guided the pieces with precision unusual for ground crews. Infantry formations began cooperating more closely with artillery. Even Allied air reconnaissance seemed more tightly coordinated, as though the Americans had learned to weave their air and ground power into a seamless fabric. By the time Hagen's Panther reached its assigned position in the line, he had heard so many accounts of the 90mm that he felt he could recognize its signature. Even without seeing the gun itself, veterans described its blast as a heavy crack, different from the sharper punch of the German 88. Others said it possessed a rolling concussive tail, a kind of echo that followed the initial boom. Some insisted the shell's impact created a unique reverberation, a deep, ringing thud that lingered longer than ordinary rounds. For all these stories, actual encounters remained rare. The Americans did not expose the guns recklessly. They placed them carefully, supported them with infantry, relocated them after firing. They used them to deny ground, not chase glory. German crews came to respect the Americans' discipline almost as much as they feared their weapons. What finally brought Hagen face to face with the 90mm occurred on a grey morning near the outskirts of a small industrial town. The battalion had been ordered to hold the line while engineers demolished a bridge behind them. The Panther stood at the edge of a field, its hull dug into a shallow scrape. Frost covered the ground, and the breath of the crew steamed inside the turret as they waited. Shortly after dawn, American armor appeared through the mist. Shermans, their silhouettes faint but unmistakable. They advanced cautiously, halting frequently, probing the ground with reconnaissance patrols. German guns opened fire from concealed positions, knocking out 2 Shermans and forcing the others to back behind a ridge. Then, without warning, a deep boom echoed across the field. A shell slammed into the stone wall Hagen's crew had been using as partial cover. The explosion hurled fragments in every direction, some clanging against the Panther's hull with alarming force. Kruger shouted, "That is the 90, reverse 2 meters, angle the hull." The driver kicked the engine to life and backed the tank until only the turret and a sliver of the glacis plate were exposed. The crew strained to locate the gun. Another round cracked from the ridge opposite them, kicking dirt into the air. The shell struck a neighboring Panther, punching a hole clean through its front armor. Flames burst from the turret, followed by a plume of smoke. "There!" Miller's voice shook as he pointed. "Near the trees, I see the muzzle flash!" Kruger barked. "Range, 1200, load armor piercing." Hagen rammed a shell into the breach. The gunner adjusted his sights, breathing hard, trying to track the faintest silhouette of the American gun nest. His finger tightened on the trigger. A third blast split the morning air. Dirt erupted beside them. The Panther rocked violently. Hagen felt the shock travel through his ribs. For a moment he feared they had been hit, but the shell had missed by less than a meter, striking a mound of earth just short of the hull. "Fire!" Kruger roared. The Panther's 75 let loose, sending its round into the trees. Whether they scored a hit, none of them could tell. The smoke and fog churned together, cloaking the entire ridge. More American shells screamed in. A Stug to their right took a direct hit, its roof peeled back like a tin lid. Another Panther withdrew under covering fire, its crew shaken but alive. The 90-millimeter guns continued their measured cadence. Boom, adjust, each report landing closer to Hagen's position. Kruger made his decision. "We cannot stay, too exposed. Pull back behind the rise." The Panther reversed, grinding through frozen mud as the crew braced themselves. Shells continued to fall, tearing the ground around them. Each impact sent tremors through the earth, vibrations that climbed Hagen's spine and rattled the gear strapped to the turret walls. When they finally reached the safety of the rise, the barrage lessened. Only then did Hagen realize his hands were trembling. He sat back against the turret wall, muscles shaking with the delayed shock of survival. For the rest of the morning, the battalion regrouped behind the ridgeline. Officers consulted maps, runners carried messages, smoke from burning vehicles drifted overhead in dark, oily ribbons. The gun duel had ended without a decisive breakthrough. Yet, the impact on morale was unmistakable. The 90-millimeter had shown itself, not merely as a rumor, not as a whisper carried along battle lines, but as a tangible force that could shatter German armor at will. Its presence changed every calculation, every movement, every decision a commander made. And for the first time since the campaign began, Hagen understood why men feared a weapon long before facing it. Because fear begins the moment you realize your own defenses might no longer be enough. The days that followed the first direct encounter with the 90-millimeter were marked by tension that no bombardment or retreat could alleviate. Hagen's battalion moved slowly eastward, shadowing a line that had once been under their control. Every ridge, every hedgerow, every open field now seemed pregnant with the possibility of unseen fire. German crews spoke in whispers, calculating distances, scanning the horizon, listening for the faint whistle of projectiles that carried with them the bitter certainty of annihilation. Hagen's own mind remained occupied by the peculiar irony of their predicament. For months, German propaganda had glorified the superiority of Panzer tanks and the might of the Waffen-SS armored divisions. Leaflets and radio broadcasts depicted the American forces as ill-trained, poorly equipped, and incapable of matching German engineering. Yet here, on the soil of their homeland, those messages had been undone by a single artillery innovation and the disciplined crews who wielded it. The 90-millimeter was, in effect, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It undermined confidence before any engagement even occurred. The battalion settled near a cluster of partially destroyed farmhouses. The winter had begun to press against the country, and frost crusted the thin mud on the roads. Men huddled in the tanks' cramped interiors, consuming cold rations of canned meat and black bread, punctuated by strong swigs of ersatz coffee. Conversations often drifted back to the American guns. Even veterans who had faced Panther and Tiger duels, who had fought across Poland, France, and the Ardennes, spoke of the 90-millimeter with the same hushed reverence once reserved for mythic weapons like the German 88. Kruger, always careful to keep his men focused, convened another briefing. Maps were spread across a damp wooden table in the remains of a barn. Runners shuffled in and out, bearing news from the front, reports from scouts, and intelligence gathered from prisoners. Hagen and the others listened as their commander outlined defensive positions, suggested fallback points, and emphasized coordination with supporting infantry. "The Americans are not reckless," Kruger said. "They will place their 90-millimeters with care, behind natural cover, in positions that command the approaches. Their guns do not rely on luck. They rely on training, on observation, and on calculation. You must respect that. Never expose your hull unnecessarily. Withdraw when in doubt. Preserve your strength. That is the only way we can survive. It was not the first time Hagen had heard this advice, but it now carried the weight of lived experience. The Panther was formidable, yes, but even its 75mm could not compete with the combined efficiency of the American gun system and the disciplined crews who operated them. What had once been an abstract fear had become tangible in the form of shattered vehicles, mangled terrain, and the hushed anxiety of the men around him. The battalion's subsequent engagements were cautious. They moved at dawn and dusk, never lingering in the open. Spotters scanned the horizon for the faint flash of gunfire or the distinctive trail of shell smoke. When American armor was sighted, the German crews would maneuver behind cover, attempting to strike only when they believed their chances of survival were maximized. The 90mm did not need to appear to dominate these battles. Its reputation alone shaped behavior. In one instance, a small American reconnaissance team advanced along a ridge toward Hagen's position. From the Panther, Hagen could see the outlines of Sherman tanks, their long barrels pointing forward. He could also detect a glint from a distant ridge, a faint metallic sheen that betrayed the presence of a 90mm. Even at over a kilometer away, the psychological effect was immediate. Men stiffened, hearts raced, and Kruger's orders came swift and precise. Withdraw, avoid engagement, keep formation. The American shells fell with predictable accuracy, cutting into a nearby armored column. Dust and debris filled the air, mixing with the acrid smell of burning fuel and scorched earth. Hagen noted how the Americans timed their fire, shifting from one target to another with minimal delay. It was as if a single mind directed the entire battlefield, and in a way, it did. Each gun crew, each forward observer, and each coordination officer functioned like cogs in a well-oiled machine. The efficiency and precision were uncanny. As weeks passed, German losses accumulated. Panthers, previously symbols of invincibility, were struck from hidden emplacements, their crews either killed outright or forced to abandon the vehicles. Tiger tanks, even with their formidable frontal armor, suffered penetration from coordinated volleys of the 90mm when supported by well-positioned infantry. The enemy's discipline, coupled with technological foresight, imposed a new reality on German operations. No armor was beyond the reach of these guns, and no advance could be taken lightly. The psychological toll extended beyond the battlefield. Hagen observed men breaking under stress, shaking while checking gun sights, and skipping meals out of fear of exposure. Letters home contained coded warnings, not of enemy territory, but of the gun itself. Soldiers spoke of the gun that sees before it strikes, in letters sent to wives and sisters, often omitting unit designations or locations to preserve operational security. Even rumors of its presence slowed movements, constrained strategic decisions, and caused hesitation in attacks that might have otherwise succeeded. In essence, the 90mm rewrote the rules of engagement without firing a single shot at many of its potential victims. In the final weeks of 1944, the German army faced relentless pressure along multiple fronts. The Ardennes offensive had faltered, the Allies pushed steadily east, and the once vaunted German war machine showed signs of fatigue. Hagen's battalion, now reduced in strength, was tasked with holding a critical junction near the Rhine. From there, they could observe American positions across the valley, and across that valley, 90mm guns waited silently, hidden by trees and terrain, their crews ready to strike at the slightest misstep. On a foggy morning, Hagen climbed into the Panther's turret, binoculars in hand, scanning the distant ridge lines. Mist hung low, muffling sound and blurring outlines. Then a faint flash, a muzzle eruption from a concealed position. Hagen's heart skipped. Another follow-up crack split the air, sending tremors through the tank. The distance was greater than any effective range for German 75 or 85 guns, but the effect was immediate. Smoke rose from a nearby field, marking the destruction of a Panzer before attempting to probe the ridge. Cries of the wounded reached them, muffled by distance, but piercing enough to chill Hagen's crew. Kruger's voice cut through the tension. "Move! Withdraw to the ridge. Avoid further engagement until reinforcements arrive." The Panther reversed into the muddy terrain, treads spitting up clumps of frozen earth. Shells continued to scream overhead, striking the ground with deafening concussions. Hagen noted the consistency with which the Americans fired. Observe, adjust, strike. Observe, adjust, strike. The discipline was frightening, unyielding, and inescapable. By late December, the cumulative effect of these encounters had reshaped the German approach to armored warfare. Crews adopted new procedures, alternating hull exposure, dispersed formations, increased reliance on infantry for reconnaissance, and rapid fallback after any exchange. Tactics that had once been instinctive were now informed by fear of a weapon whose presence could be felt long before it was seen. Hagen reflected on a particularly harrowing day near the banks of the Rhine. They had taken up a defensive position behind a ruined factory with a small force of infantry providing forward screening. The Americans advanced carefully, their reconnaissance spotting both men and vehicles. Then a sudden series of artillery bursts erupted from positions on the far ridge. One Panther was destroyed instantly. Another burned for minutes before the crew escaped. Hagen's tank survived only because he had anticipated the likely trajectory and angled the hull into a depression in the ground. The silence that followed the barrage was deafening. Dust settled in slow motes, drifting in shafts of pale sunlight. Hagen realized then that survival had become as much about psychology as skill. Each crew member understood that hesitation or miscalculation could mean instant death. Confidence in the tank's armor, once a given, had been replaced by cautious respect for unseen threats. The 90mm was more than a gun. It was a presence that dominated thought, dictated movement, and reshaped strategy. In reflecting on the campaign, Hagen would later recall the irony most vividly. The fear of the weapon, even before direct engagement, had forced German crews to act defensively, to limit risk, and to abandon positions that might otherwise have been held. Entire operational plans were altered due to anticipation of a gun that, in technical terms, was formidable but not invincible. It was the combination of disciplined crews, integrated fire control, and careful placement that transformed it into a weapon capable of changing behavior without firing a single shot at some targets. The war itself continued to unravel for Germany. American advances pressed relentlessly, supported by overwhelming logistics and industrial output. The 90mm guns multiplied in number and were increasingly paired with infantry and mobile anti-tank platforms. Each deployment demonstrated the psychological as well as physical impact of these weapons. They embodied a lesson that the German army learned the hard way. Technological and tactical advantage extends far beyond mere specifications. It influences thought, confidence, and initiative. By the time the war reached the German heartland, Hagen had witnessed multiple engagements in which the 90mm dictated the pace of battle. Entire units avoided conflict, retreating preemptively to preserve what remained of their forces. The very knowledge that such a weapon existed, its range, penetration, and disciplined use shaped every operational decision, demonstrating that in war, the mind often surrenders before the body. Hagen would later describe it as a weapon that fought in silence until it struck. After the surrender, as Hagen returned to his village, he noted the long shadow cast by technological superiority. Tanks and guns had been destroyed, yes, but more enduring was the memory of a weapon that could dominate thought. Veterans spoke not only of battlefield exploits, but of anticipation, of planning under constant threat, and of the dread of the 90mm's unseen muzzle. Its legacy, Hagen reflected, was less about material loss and more about the subtle ways in which war reshapes perception and behavior. The story of the 90mm and of those who feared it without ever fully confronting it illustrates a profound historical irony. The weapon's power lay not solely in metallurgy or ballistics, but in the integration of technology, training, and psychological effect. German crews had prepared for armored combat with confidence in their tanks and doctrine. Yet, through a combination of precision engineering and disciplined operation, the Americans created a tool that forced caution, shaped decision-making, and instilled respect even before the first round struck. In the quiet aftermath, Hagen often thought about the nature of fear itself. It could be engineered as effectively as any weapon and deployed long before physical engagement. The 90mm had achieved this. It became a force multiplier, not simply by firing shells, but by commanding the minds and movements of those who opposed it. And in that, it revealed one of war's most subtle truths. Superiority in combat extends far beyond what is seen. It is measured equally in perception, anticipation, and the relentless discipline of those who wield it. By the winter of 1945, as the Allies pressed into central Germany and the Reich's defenses crumbled, the psychological imprint of the 90mm remained. Veterans recounted their experiences to young soldiers, to historians, and in post-war memoirs. Accounts consistently emphasized that the most immediate effect of the gun was not on armor or logistics, but on human behavior, on the hesitation it produced, the caution it demanded, and the constant mental calculation it imposed. Those who faced it, or even merely knew of it, carried a lasting imprint of respect and fear, a testament to the enduring power of integrated military innovation. Hagen's reflections, penned decades later, capture the essence of this reality. He wrote of the long shadow cast by the gun, of the Panther crews who maneuvered cautiously across open fields, of the strategic retreats guided by anticipation rather than engagement, and of the silent lessons learned in frost-covered farmyards and bombed-out villages. The 90mm, though a single component of the American arsenal, had achieved something remarkable. It had reshaped the psychology of an opposing army before it could physically dominate the battlefield. And in that reshaping, the war itself provides its most profound lesson. In the theater of conflict, fear can be as decisive as fire, and innovation's true power lies not only in destruction, but in the anticipation it generates. German crews feared the 90mm before facing it, and in doing so, they revealed the quiet but inexorable influence of human psychology under the strain of war. The war ended, and the surviving crews of Panzer and Tiger tanks returned home, carrying not only the scars of combat, but also the indelible memory of a weapon that had shaped their every decision. In barracks, and later in memoirs, the 90mm emerged repeatedly as a symbol of precision, discipline, and psychological dominance. Soldiers who had faced it, or merely known of it, spoke of hesitation that had become instinctive, of retreats executed not from direct engagement, but from the anticipation of devastating fire. Military historians later noted that the American system, combining the 90mm with centralized fire control and trained crews, exemplified a shift in modern warfare. Technology alone did not guarantee supremacy. Its integration into doctrine and human execution was equally decisive. The gun's impact extended beyond destroyed tanks. It forced changes in German tactics, slowed offensives, and demonstrated how fear could be weaponized as effectively as firepower. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.